Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Beer Thunder. I'm Squish, and this is going to be a video that features a little bit more of flying a plane and talking about it, but there's also unfortunately going to be a segue into Microsoft Excel so that you guys can examine and partake firsthand or secondhand in what I'm going to call my MiG-29 derangement syndrome. Anyways, we're going to start out with just some random gameplay. I'm on Denmark right now, and I'm just showing this just to kind of show that the MiG-29, in spite of as much as we're going to talk about the flight model, some of its history, and kind of the state that it exists within the game, that it's still, for all intents and purposes, a reasonably capable plane. There's no reason to go out of your way to completely avoid this, especially in kind of the situations that exist within the meta of the game as it currently exists. Now, just because the plane is viable and okay, it doesn't mean that it couldn't be better, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't want to make it better, or we shouldn't want to make it more accurate to the things that we understand or the things that we believe to understand. Because decoupling all of those things and decoupling the things that we know versus the things that we think that we know, and trying to reconcile multiple factors at the same time, is what makes doing this video so hard. In reality, I had most of the outline for this video done last week, and what happened is I kept adding information to my big trove of information. I kept doing more test cases. Some of my underlying assumptions, some of the methods that I used to get to that conclusion were challenged, and then I re-verified them, and then I changed them, and I could explain why the initial assumption was wrong. That by the time I get to this week, by the time that I get to publishing this video, I do have a conclusion. But more so, not only do I have a conclusion, I would not call that conclusion concrete, and I would not call that conclusion not subject to change. And hopefully throughout the process of this video, you guys will see that process in action and be able to approach some of these issues from a little bit of a more logical perspective. In reality, what I'm trying to do with this video isn't necessarily to arrive to a concrete conclusion, because it'd be too easy to go out there and just say, oh, boo-hoo, the MiG-29 sucks, America rocks, Russia suffers, wham, 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 Gaijin hates my plane. That's too easy, but that doesn't really dive into the nitty-gritty of it, of maybe how we have ended up here, and treat the subject with any kind of nuance. In fact, this video is probably going to raise as many questions as it provides answers, and it is going to be by no means conclusive. Instead, it doesn't represent the start of a conversation, because that's kind of too new agey, but rather a continuation of ongoing conversations that I've been having for a very long time now, that I'm going to include my viewership in to see the thought process and see kind of how my brain works, and, you know, take you along for a fun little ride of blowing some planes up in the MiG-29 and maybe trying to save the flight model. So where do we begin? Well, I think the most logical place to start is with a little bit of a history lesson, a little bit of my impression of the MiG-29's history and the way that it existed in real life, because the way that I perceive that it existed in real life does inform the way that I perceive that it should exist in the game. And I think that anyone with a shred of intellectual honesty would say the same thing. Anyways, let's get to the history of the MiG-29 as I perceive it to be, because this is not going to be exhaustive. This is not going to be a Mark Felton documentary from the inception to the last MiG-29 getting blown up in Ukraine. This is just going to be my impression and my perception of the planes. Wham, bam, 1982 happens, and the MiG-29 enters service. It represents the USSR's first operational fourth-generation fighter, although technologically speaking, the plane is kind of a transition between the third and fourth generations. In a lot of ways, it's similar to the F-14 and the F-15 insofar that it still relies on a mechanically, hydraulically controlled flight control system. In a lot of ways, it is a fourth generation airframe design using third generation technology. This is also why kind of separating planes into generations is kind of not all that useful, at least when talking in great detail. It's also important to keep in mind that the MiG-29 enters service after the F-14, the F-15, alongside the F-18, and also after the F-16. So, in a lot of ways, mechanically speaking, the USSR is behind, at least in the finer details of the way that they get the job done. Usually in the West, our understanding of the MiG-29 and the Su-27 is always filtered through and biased based on our understanding of the F-15 and the F-16, because normally what we see is that these planes are always contextualized as being diametrically opposed to each other, with an implication that the doctrines are similar. And I think that this is a useful comparison in layman's terms. I think it's fairly accurate to say that the MiG-29 is the cheaper, less elegant, tactical level alternative and supplement to the true air superiority fighter, which is the Su-27, in the same way that the F-16 was a cheaper supplementary fighter to get more fighters, more capability for a better price, more widely dispersed for the American Air Force. At the same time, I think there is some nuance that is lost in this understanding, because the Soviet air doctrine is just completely different than both American doctrines. And I say both American doctrines because I would even draw a distinction between the American Air Force doctrine versus the Navy doctrine. And if you talk to like American pilots, I think a lot of them would probably agree the same thing, that the pilot cultures just between the two American air powers is just different, and that there are some important distinctions. And I think that because of this, in the West, maybe we don't understand the MiG-29 through the prism that might be the most helpful. Because my understanding is that the MiG-29 is kind of a replacement for planes like the MiG-23 and the MiG-21, that it's this short-range point defense fighter that it gets a mission, the ground controller scrambles it, the pilot follows the directions, he targets the stuff that he's supposed to target, he shoots his missiles, and then he leaves the area because the ground controller told him to. Where the Soviet doctrine doesn't really prioritize using the pilot as kind of like the primary decision maker, the guy on the ground, the guy with the radar screen, the guy that understands the bigger overall operational picture that needs to make sure that all of these set pieces move together at a time when communication might not necessarily be all that great, under circumstances where, if you're anticipating a nuclear war or a major conflict, where maybe having all these big major set moving pieces that is done as this giant reaction makes a little bit more sense in that context. Also, it's important to understand that although the MiG-29 and the F-16 might have some similarities, the Su-27 and the F-15 might have some similarities, they also have some really distinct differences. One of the things that a lot of people forget with the Su-27 or don't even really understand is that if you go look at a map, Russia is pretty darn big. Russia has a lot of airspace to defend, much more so than America, and it's not branched by a bunch of friendly nations that really serve as a buffer zone. Yes, in the 1980s, they did have the Warsaw Pact, which, yes, does function as this perceived speed bump to this eventual Western invasion, because in Russian history, they believe that the West is always waiting to invade them, which, to be fair, in the 1900s, it happened twice. If you go to the 1870s, that adds at least another one time with the Crimean War, where in a lot of ways I think the Crimean War is culturally really important to understanding the ways that Russians perceive the world, or at least the ways that Russian historians perceive the world. But anyways, that's a sidetrack. The other thing to understand is the Soviet air defense system, the Soviet Air Force, also has the MiG-31 as one of its long-range, high-altitude fighters to really like cover all the distance. Like the Soviet Union has too much airspace to actually effectively utilize aerial tankers. They could have the same aerial tanker fleet size that America has, and they still wouldn't be able to do it if they didn't design their planes in a certain way. That's why the Su-27, if you look at the manual, has an overload fuel and it has a normal fuel, where normal fuel is 50%. Normal fuel is kind of like the fighter air superiority mode, where overload fuel is kind of the interceptor mode, where, like, hey, the plane has to cover a lot of distance, and it has to do it without aerial refueling, and it has to do it without drop tanks. Or it makes sense to do it without drop tanks because drop tanks are going to rob it of its performance. And when it comes to the MiG-29, when it comes to understanding the MiG-29, is a lot of people want to point to the ducts on the plane and how rough it is around the edges, and use phrases like rugged, it's reliable. And I don't know that I would describe it that way. I think those are kind of meaningless fluff words for people that don't know what they're talking about. And I say this as a guy that doesn't know what he's talking about, and I'm not going to call it rugged. I will say it's rough around the edges. I think maybe the most relatable way to characterize the MiG-29 is that it's kind of like a Chevy Corvette, where it looks sleek and iconic from a distance. It looks refined. It's not really until you put it side by side with another European sports car and let a European critique it that you might find some of the features to be wanting. Maybe the interior is a little bit too plasticky. Maybe the panel gap's a little bit too big. Maybe just slapping a naturally aspirated big V8 in a lightweight car isn't the answer to all of the world's problems. And maybe in this conversation, you might feel a little bit inadequate about your sports car at the end. That is until you ask one very important question. How fast does your car go? And when he tells you that his BMW M5 Supersport goes 155 miles per hour because it's governed for responsible use on the Autobahn, you slam a PBR, do a burnout in the school zone, go smash a mailbox, and ask yourself, why were you ever friends with a BMW owner to begin with? And that's what the MiG-29 is. It's rough around the edges. It's sloppy. It's utilitarian. It gets the job done. At least that's the way that it is on paper. In practice, the MiG-29 has had an overall lackluster combat record. So why is that? Well, I think the answer is pretty simple. I think it really just comes down to circumstances and timing. One of the things to keep in mind when we're evaluating combat aircraft and their combat record is to understand that these things don't exist in a vacuum. That a plane is a system within a system of other systems. And oftentimes the burden that the MiG-29 was being asked to bear was something that far eclipsed its capabilities and far eclipsed the numbers that were available and the training that was available to the pilots. For instance, you could have taken all of the MiG-29s that Iraq had in either of the Gulf Wars and replaced them with any existing fourth generation fighter, and it would not have made a single iota of difference in the air campaigns. It just wasn't going to happen. When it comes to analyzing some of these smaller scale wars between, say, for instance, Pakistan and India, I still think some of the same circumstances are going to apply. It's for the same reason that with the F-16 being deployed in Ukraine, that by itself, it's not really enough to change the tide of the air. The same thing with the Rafale in India, why its combat record currently is negative. Another issue with the MiG-29's combat record is that it really hasn't aged all that gracefully. What happened in the 1980s and 1990s was a pretty substantial revolution in the miniaturization of electronics, which also ended up coinciding with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union collapsed and the Russian Federation reformed, the Russians have more or less invested most of their resources into the Su-27. Yes, modernized versions of the MiG-29 do exist with better radars, better avionics, fly-by-wire controls, multi-role capability, but by and large, those variants haven't really been adopted en masse. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon due to the current war in Ukraine. Historically, this means that the MiG-29 really only enjoys about 5 to 6 years where it can genuinely be considered a cutting-edge combat aircraft. And I'm going to bookmark that statement with 2 key events and then kind of a final nail in the coffin. The first bookmark, the part where the MiG-29 truly becomes relevant, the part where it distinguishes itself, is with the adoption of the R-73, with the adoption of the helmet-mounted sight and the high off-bore sight capability. The part where the MiG-29 becomes irrelevant is in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because once the Soviet Union collapses, there's really nobody that can field this fighter in the numbers and with the training and the infrastructure and the whole system of systems to go with it to really make it effective. The final nail in the coffin for the MiG-29, by the way, is in 1991 with the adoption of the AMRAAM. As the Soviet Union has collapsed and AMRAAMs and AMRAAM-like missiles begin to proliferate, the MiG-29 kind of gets left behind. Now, that doesn't mean that full hard stop 1990 hits and the Soviet Union collapses and the MiG-29 is immediately obsolete as a platform, but rather that its obsolescence is written on the wall. It is set in stone. It's really, really hard to overstate how cataclysmic and how impactful the collapse of the Soviet Union was, or the Soviet Empire was, on not only the aircraft industry and not only on the former Soviet quote-unquote republics and Russia as a whole. To put things in perspective, during the Great Depression, America lost about 25% of its gross domestic product between 1929 and 1933. By 1936, gross domestic product had reached 1929 levels. So it went down 25% and then recovered 25% between 1929 and 1936. So about 7 years or so. 7 years. Let's keep that in mind while we try to quantify the greatest historical event in European history since World War II. 7 years, keep that in mind as I say this, because from 1990 to 1998, an 8-year period, Russian GDP collapsed by 40%, which is an order of magnitude greater than the American GDP collapse during the Great Depression, and it's spread out over a longer period of time. Russian GDP doesn't recover to its pre-1990 levels until 2005, 15 years later after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Now, before I go down the Vladimir Putin is a demented old man still fighting the Crimean War of 1853 tangent, because the last thing YouTube needs is another random English-speaking white person proselytizing about the trinity of free market capitalism, Western democracy, and NATO. Now, if you do want to hear about the Gospels, you're going to have to buy me some beer first. And this would be a really good point in the video to plug my Patreon, if I had it. If I had one, I wouldn't have a tier list. I would have a beer list. Anyways, this is just a really elaborate way of saying that there is a 10 to 15 year period where McCoyan is barely able to keep the lights on, and the lights are probably not even on half the time because they've been stolen and sold on the private market. And for the MiG-29, this means that its development as an aircraft and a weapons platform was rather stunted. I think it would be fair to assume that a fully modernized F-16 Block 70 is a much more capable and more thoroughly developed platform than a MiG-35. And this isn't to denigrate the engineers that work on the MiG-35 or to minimize the effort that Russia has put into modernizing their aircraft and catching up to what is effectively a 10-year additional head start that the rest of the West received due to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, I know for a fact there is someone out there that is typing up a very, very in-depth and very, very detailed response about how my impressions of the MiG-35 are totally and utterly and irredeemably wrong because the radar modules are made out of ceramic carbidium nitride and that the RWR warning system has twin butthole reflectors that are capable of detecting an F-22 at 65 nautical miles, that the super advanced next generation, totally definitely not Grok downloaded to a Raspberry Pi, will be able to simultaneously complete a New York Times crossword puzzle while optimizing what cluster munitions to drop on my local hospital, kindergarten, or wedding. And to that, I have to say, I don't care. Don't post it. It's a waste of time. You're not going to get a receptive audience. Because at the end of the day, I am not a weapons geek. I don't wank off to marketing brochures of weapon systems to ascertain their potential capabilities and try to read between the lines and theorize about real-life air combat, because I really don't care. What I do care about is being a War Thunder channel. Speaking of War Thunder, let's talk about the MiG-29 in War Thunder, because ultimately that's supposed to be what this video is about, and ultimately why you watch my YouTube channel. Now, back in the good old days when the MiG-29 was added as a counterpart to the F-16 at the same time, the MiG-29 was added in a state where the flight model was quite good. Yes, I'm glancing over the first 2 months where it was kind of shitty, but ultimately there was around 8 to 9 month period where the MiG-29 was the strongest, best plane in the game. It was stronger than the F-16, mainly due to the R-27ER, and the F-16 still had merit because it did have better IR missiles in the form of the 9L versus the R-60, and the F-16 did have a flight model that would eventually beat the MiG-29, but only once the fight had progressed through 2 or 3 turns. The MiG-29 still had a stronger initial turn, and ultimately the MiG-29 for competitive players ended up being preferred. I think the first air superiority tournament had basically the final was nothing but MiG-29s versus each other, and a lot of that really comes down to the utility of the R-27ER. Now, a lot of people got really upset about the R-27ER and will tell you that it was overpowered and meta-defining, and to an extent it was, but not usually in the way that most people claim, because everyone forgets that 100-meter multipathing was a thing, and that meta was already well established by the time the MiG-29 came out. But even then, at the end of the day, the R-27ER having a quicker time to kill, a quicker time to impact, meant that as soon as you popped above multipath, you merge with the guy, you go up, the next guy blows you out of the sky, and then the AIM-7, you can defeat it head-on just by kind of barrel rolling it at the right time. So overall, the utility of the R-27ER is something to be considered when discussing the old MiG-29 as far as balance goes. As far as flight models go, though, it was probably one of the times where people were more or less content. There was an issue with the F-16's G-limiter, kind of pseudo G-limiter thing early on. They eventually did kind of tweak the parameters for it and did get it fixed, and then ultimately kind of removed it. But even then, the F-16, when it came to a 1 versus 1 gunfight, the F-16 was ever so slightly a little bit stronger, but the MiG-29 could cook. So, what happened to the MiG-29? Well, here's what happened. Gaijin took some bigger numbers and reduced them into smaller numbers. What Gaijin did is they took the maximum lift coefficient and reduced it from 1.55 down to 1.45, and did a couple tweaks with the Oswald's efficiency as well. And ultimately, this is what it gets us. The sustained turn, SEP0, is lowered by just a little bit, by about 1 to 1.5 degrees per second across the board. More importantly, though, all of your higher end numbers, all of your bleed rates, are actually lowered significantly, and the change to the plane makes it so that when you actually do pull hard, when you convert excess speed into position, basically, you slow down a lot quicker than you used to. And this is more or less what has made the plane irredeemable in the eyes of a lot of people. That if you stick to sustained turns, if you stay fast, and you focus mainly on rate fighting and never making any big changes in speed of going from fast to slow, you'll be okay. You can make the flight model kind of sort of work, and you can wait for the other guy to kind of hang himself up. That's kind of what you saw in the very, very beginning of the video. But as soon as you start going aggressive, as soon as you start pulling, you end up super slow. And then the only flight envelope that you actually get to be competitive in is basically if both planes are stalling in a perfect vertical. And here's kind of an example right here. Maybe not the best, but me and Butters are going to start one circle. He's going to get the low position, and as we cross over, he's going to pitch up and he's going to try to attack me. And I'm going to try to pitch up and deny the attack, but I just don't have the lift to do it. And what's going to happen here is he gets a nice free head-on shot, and I'm not able to really angle into him and do anything about it. I'm just kind of sitting there hopeless. Where if you go really aggressive early on in the MiG-29, that's ultimately what is going to happen to you these days. Now, here's going to be an example of a different approach. Me and Butters merge. I still go vertical because I still want to go vertical because I need to conserve my speed, and I can always trade altitude for speed. But because I can't really convert excess speed into position, I do have to kind of wait for Butters to make the first move, and I have to fly around those moves and then respond to them. And I need to keep my speed up, but I need to keep my speed up in such a way that he doesn't convert his excess speed into position and then just sit behind me. Because in the MiG-29, as soon as you're defensive, as soon as the other guy gets even a little bit behind you, a little bit on your 6, the fight's basically over. Usually what happens when you talk to people that do say, oh, the MiG-29 is still really good, is they do try to attempt to do something like this, where they're going to try to stick to very high speed turns to try to maximize that sustained turn rate, because that's the only kind of area on the flight envelope where it gets to be competitive against other things. And against newer opponents, that sometimes works, because you can play around them and they can bleed all of their energy. But as soon as you get an experienced opponent, as soon as you get someone who actually is on your same skill level or even a little bit worse, they can still play around you and play around the fact that you can't convert extra speed into position. And you're going to see that here, as I'm already behind Butters. I'm in a pretty favorable spot. He's in the F-15C, which is the worst of the F-15s, and all he's doing is he's accelerating, and he's getting separation, gaining speed, gaining energy, and staying out of my gun range. Now, in theory, I could pull really, really hard at an earlier point in this turn when he was really, really far away, get a cheeky shot, hit it, and then cool, the fight's done. But that's not what's going to happen here, because if I do that and I miss, I'm a sitting duck. And really the only thing that he's doing here is he's holding permanent lag pursuit and just going around me, hoping that I bleed my energy. And I'm trying to look for a spot where I can bleed my energy, but also end up close enough to him to actually shoot him. And I almost had it there. I thought that I could get it, but I couldn't. And now I'm slow, and I'm kind of stuck here, and I need to look for a position now where I can accelerate and get back up to that really, really high speed and not let him come into me. And because I'm slow here, he comes into me, and it's going to almost reset the fight. But right here, because he has that extra lift, because he has the ability to angle in, he gets to shoot me down, and I get to die. And this matchup will play out basically identically with the F-16C. We're going to merge, and I'm going to go up, and I'm going to try to go for a little bit of a higher position. And as he opens flat and I go across the top here, I should be able to come down onto him and have a little bit of a more favorable starting position. But because he's an F-16C, and because he's just going to stick and lag, and we're going to do this merry-go-round for a long time, he is just going to pretty easily end up behind me. This is pretty much a very by-the-book style rate fight. This will be very similar to probably some of the BFM videos that you see on DCS, or that you see that are like, oh, this is a real pilot in real life. A lot of times you will see a situation that looks like this. I am in a better position here for the time being, but I can't really convert that speed into really anything to do with it. So I just have to really sit here at 750, 780, near the blackout limit, and just hope that he doesn't know what he's doing. Now, in a random game, this actually works pretty good. Usually when you get behind a guy, he panics, he pulls really hard, he gets a little bit of his position back, and then he's slow. You can go up and then drop in on top of him and then blow him up. That's basically what I was doing to the guys in the F-18s and the F-16s early in random games. That doesn't work against a guy who's practiced it all. And that's rather unfortunate, because what I think this means is ultimately, from what I've seen, at least from pilot interviews, and I've watched a lot of them, and I don't think that you can gain any kind of useful performance metrics out of them. And I think it's really easy to get lost in the sauce about them and go, oh, well, this guy says this plane's better in 1991, so therefore it was better, but we don't know the circumstances, kind of thing. But if you watch interviews with guys that fly F-16s or F-18s, the things that they have to say about the MiG-29 is basically that the F-16 guys will say that fighting a MiG-29 is a lot like fighting against an F-18, but the F-18 is on steroids. And the F-18 guys will say that it's a lot like fighting against an F-16. And I think in totality, the way that I've rationalized this in my tiny little peanut brain is that in real life, in a dogfight, the MiG-29 probably has a good balance of the capabilities of the F-16 and the F-18, but doesn't outshine either of those planes in the things that they are specifically good at. So what this means to me is I don't think in real life the MiG-29 easily outrates the F-16. I think an F-16 that sticks to a rate fight in real life will win. At the same time, in real life, I don't think the MiG-29 is more capable than the F-18 when it comes to its nose positioning. And I don't think it's as capable as the F-18 in real life when it comes to fighting at these like extra low speeds. And I think doctrinally speaking, the guys that have been practicing BFM against dissimilar aircraft, these guys are training against other NATO pilots flying MiG-29s for the most part, or have NATO-style training. Now, the other issue with trying to piece together any kind of usable information from these pilot reports or pilot interviews, these magazine articles, is that a lot of these interviews are really in relation to the early training against the MiG-29s that were inherited from East Germany, which means that early on, the thing that everyone was glazing, the thing that everyone was really surprised about, was the R-73 and the helmet-mounted sight. And what this means is that we really don't know how influential the R-73 was to the outcome of these fights. And we also don't really know the rule set or what the criteria for an R-73 kill was. So let's say, for instance, that the kill criteria is anything within 45 degrees of the plane and anything greater than 600 meters away. That means that basically right now, as he comes across this circle and I go over the top and I lose all of my speed and he tries to outrate me, that in real life, maybe in those exercises, this right here is considered a kill. Maybe this is the point where it's like, okay, cool, you got killed, you died, reset the exercise. We don't know what those criteria were, and we don't know how influential they were to the outcomes of these fights. Indulge me for a second and allow me to do a little bit of theory crafting here, because what I think probably most likely happened in real life is that the R-73 did present a technical challenge and was influential, that it did spur the development of new generations of IR missiles with similar capabilities or even better capabilities like the AIM-9X, the IRIS-T, and the ASRAMmer. At the same time, I don't think that means that the MiG-29 airframe and its performance was purely carried just by the presence of the R-73. Most likely what happened is that in early trainings and early dogfights with the R-73 being in play, that the old school approach to dogfighting didn't work, that there were some gaps that needed to be filled, and that there were some techniques that needed to be developed in order to counter the high off-bore sight capability of the MiG-29. What this looks like is probably a refinement into the way that an F-16 would approach the first couple turns of a dogfight, different approaches to the way that it enters, and really just different reactions to visual cues. So, for instance, when a MiG-29 pulls really hard across the circle, and it's really only limited to guns, if you have a shit ton of energy and can just get out of the way of it and go up and post up above it and then drop in on top of it, that's perfectly valid. At the same time, if he only has to get within 45 degrees of you, hit a button, and then you explode, that means that that reaction is no longer a valid tactic, and that means that that reaction, where it would be a guaranteed and easy win previously, would be a guaranteed and quick loss. It also means that the initial entry, say for instance that the initial entry, now instead of sticking to more of a rate fight regime, that you'll have to transition to an initial turn that's probably a lot harder to really kind of shrink down that radius of the MiG-29 to keep it close enough to you so that it can't shoot at you with the missile, and then accelerate back up to a rate speed, and then get back to the point that you're comfortable with, where your comfort position is going to be different just due to the presence of the missile. I say this only as a War Thunder player. I am not a pilot. I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about, because that is what the missile does in War Thunder. It takes some entries and some positions that are normally in a vacuum advantageous, and will turn them into a disadvantage. Just its presence alone alters the way that you're supposed to fight. And I think it's fair to assume that something similar would play out in real life. Maybe not in exactly the same way, because dogfighting in War Thunder is inherently completely different from real life. There are a lot of aspects that are in real life that don't apply to War Thunder and vice versa. There are things in real life that you would never be allowed to do that you can do every single time in War Thunder for basically no consequences. Like merging the way that we are right now, very close at very high speeds at very low altitude, is just something that would never be allowed. That passing cockpit to cockpit at 500 miles per hour or 500 kph at like 3 feet away, in real life that gets you fired. In real life that causes crashes and causes 2 pilots to die, and that's not really good because pilots are kind of expensive. The other thing that War Thunder doesn't capture is really the physicality of it either, because in real life 9Gs is kind of a big deal, and War Thunder pulling 10 to 12 doesn't really matter, and you have a pretty much set in stone recovery time. It means that in real life there's probably some strategies that you can use that just don't really apply to the game. Hypothetically, there are situations where you could probably just focus on tiring the pilot out in real life. Say, for instance, the F-16. Yeah, it's a 9G plane all day long. Yeah, but the guy inside of it isn't a 9G pilot all day long. That guy has an endurance limit. And there might be situations where in real life that your best strategy might just be to sit on the inside circle at a lower speed at 7Gs and just keep forcing that guy in the F-16 to maintain 9Gs and eventually just tire himself out, lose his lunch, and then you get a pull in and kill him. That's something that just isn't really present in War Thunder. That's not to say that I know this for sure. That's just to say that there are multiple factors to consider when trying to relate real-life pilot reports to what we see in War Thunder. There are so many variables that are present that we don't really try to take into account, that really we can't make an overall super-duper informed decision on what amounts to random magazine articles and podcast interviews. However, it is fun to speculate. Oh yeah, where was I? Oh yeah, big MiG-29 flight model nerf. That's what I was talking about again. Okay, so anyways, with the MiG-29, with the way that it currently is, we don't actually know if it's realistic yet. I haven't addressed the realism concern, because with the realism concern, we have to understand a couple of different things. That there are a couple of different scenarios that can be playing out at the same time in different directions in ways that one thing cancels the other, that amplifies a third thing, that causes a conclusion of potatoes. These possibilities include the following in no particular order: that A, the flight model is accurate, and really is all of the other flight models that are the problem because they are inaccurate. B, this flight model could be inaccurate while all of the other flight models are accurate. C, all of the flight models across the board are inaccurate. C++, all of the flight models are inaccurate, but they're all skewed in the same way, so overall the matchup remains the same. B, they end up skewed in opposite directions, where one thing amplifies another, and the final conclusion and the final situation is both, none, all of the above, and potatoes. The last possibility is that we all just suck and we're just waiting for Fulcrum Jesus to come and save us and show us how to play the plane after it's been in the game for 4 years. So how bad is the MiG-29? How much would the plane have to be changed and improved to actually kind of bring it on par with some of the planes that we consider to be its peers? Well, the answer to how close it is that it depends. A lot of people would argue that's not close based on their experience. But I would say it's closer than people expect. It helps to really remember that even a simple 1 to 2 degree change in the Rafale knocked it down about 3 to 4 places on the dueling tree. Small things can make a pretty big difference. For instance, just running the scenario with the F-16 confined to damping did make that fight a lot more competitive. Right now, as it stands, if the fight is like a really tight vertical spiral, or the 29 holds a good bit of its energy, it can almost sort of cook. However, its Achilles heel really is that bleed rate. For all the speed that you build up, you can't really convert it into any kind of winning position. If the fight goes vertical and it stays really close and it goes to the stall and it comes down to just pure nose authority, the MiG-29 can kind of cook. It does have a small window in its high AOA part that can be a little bit surprising, but figuring out how to use this on a consistent basis is rather difficult. And in reality, the F-18 basically just does the same thing but better, and it's better in every way across the board, at least in terms of turn performance. The Mirage 2000 in sim also ends up just being a better, much stronger, much more usable MiG-29. Anecdotally speaking, I think that these matchups will be a lot closer in real life, and I think from a gameplay perspective, there is a pretty good rationale for buffing the MiG-29 flight model. So why did Gaijin ruin a good thing? Why did Gaijin take that 1.55 lift coefficient and reduce it down to 1.45? The answer is we don't really know. The answer is the developers have never told us directly, so a lot of the explanations out there that you see are basically just purely speculation. The more important question to ask is whether or not this change was realistic. Is there any factual basis for this change? And I think that there might actually be. I think I might have a reasonable explanation, but in order to get to that, we are going to have to transition to dun 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 Microsoft Excel. Yep, we're gonna have to go into my gigantic spreadsheet of deranged schizophrenia, and that's gonna be right up next. Also, me getting blown up in the MiG-29 is actually fake news. I won every round. Welcome to hell. I mean, Microsoft Excel, so hell plus plus. And initially this video was really going to focus solely on this bit of math up here, and then I started adding more stuff and things to the spreadsheet and going down different rabbit holes that we have what is really just a huge mess. And I'm going to start at the top. I'm going to work my way down. I'm going to jump around and kind of explain what the hell is going on here. Now, all of these numbers up here, all of these AOA values, everything that is derived in green and brown, all of these numbers over here, all of this math, this is crap math. This math here doesn't work. This math was based on an assumption that I made that was erroneous, that I did go back and then correct after someone pointed it out, because I don't really have like a team of proofreaders, but because it's an ongoing conversation, it does get brought up. And someone pointed out to me, Prey pointed out to me, like, hey, the way that you are deriving this, it doesn't actually work. And what I did for this stuff is I took this diagram, and this is a wing coefficient of lift, coefficient of drag diagram from the MiG-29 flight manual, or the MiG-29 aerodynamics manual, and I tried to extrapolate, tried to pull it apart to get a coefficient of lift curve that corresponded to angle of attack, and then to get a coefficient of drag curve that corresponded to angle of attack. And, well, it doesn't actually work that way. The way that I did it is I took the data point from in-game of 1.45, 1.4, whatever it is, at 28 AOA, and I used that as kind of like the datum here, as kind of like the set point. And in my brain, I was like, well, if this is 28, this over here is probably 30, and this stuff all the way down here is going to be around 0. And if 0 is here and 28 is here, well, 14 would be roughly in the middle, right? Well, when you do that, it gets you this kind of diagram. And this gets us our coefficient lift and coefficient drag. Unfortunately, it doesn't actually work that way. It is set up in such a way that 14 degrees AOA is not going to correspond to 0.2, whatever this is down here for coefficient of drag. It just doesn't work that way. And it means that all of the math that I did based on pulling it apart and getting this chart up here just doesn't work. It's all crap. But it's still there. It's still there because, I mean, it's neat to look at, and it's neat to show that, hey, we do actually have, you know, a little bit of integrity. But in addition to this, before I even caught this error, before I did this, I also started kind of evaluating the plane in different ways, because just evaluating the plane based on this CLCD diagram isn't, you know, really compelling. It doesn't really show how Gaijin got to its end result. Now, I will say, one of the things to notice about this diagram, though, is that 1.0 is over here, and these are 0.1 increments. And we go from 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, 1.5, and we go all the way over here to the maximum lift coefficient on here, and sure enough, we have 1.46, which means that probably the reason that Gaijin reduced the lift coefficient is probably because they read this chart. And that's probably why it went down from 1.55, which would be like kind of up here, and they moved it kind of down here. And they indexed it so that 28 AOA is kind of like roughly here, so to speak. The game, the way that the coefficient of lift in the game works is it reaches up to, I think, 1.4, and then it just goes, falls off, and just becomes dog shit. I don't think you can derive that from this chart because, I mean, you could make the argument that, well, look, the previous thing, it goes up in a 15-degree line, and if you pulled more AOA, your lift coefficient should be up here. You could make that argument. I'm not making that argument because, I mean, I don't know. I need to find more information, which is to say that the realism portion of this video is not going to be as necessarily set in stone as I would like it to be. Like, I would like everything to be like a neat little bow, and you tie it up and like, okay, cool, we bring it home and it's good to go. The next thing that I did before I was even going into correcting this error is I decided to find the MiG-29G chart for sustained turn rate and get those values and then convert them into turn rates in order to be able to compare the real MiG-29G turn line to the StatShark turn line, and then compare them to what we see in game. Now, and that's how we get kind of this table down here in this chart. Now let's explain what we have going on here. So what I have going on here is I have the real values from the MiG-29G manual plotted in blue. The way that I got these values is I took the G values in the MiG-29 manual and I applied a math formula to convert those values to degrees per second. That's how I get this. That's going to be this blue line down here. This red line is degrees per second in StatShark. This is the way the computer program models it. And then this green line is from in-game testing, because in the past I've noticed that WTRTI, for as good as it is and for as much as I like the program, sometimes gets things a little bit wrong, sometimes overestimates some things. So going back and testing it in-game gives us a little bit of a better idea. Now, I will say with my testing, I'm not super in-depth about it, so these data points, I didn't go through and set the trim percentage and get a nice 30-second turn with no bleed rate, no changes in altitude, no nothing. I kind of did it with a control stick, kind of eyeballed it and said, you know what, as long as it's within plus or minus 0.3 degrees per second, I'm pretty comfortable with it. So this green line is not like gospel truth. This could be shifted up, down, in a couple data points just a little bit, and it'd be fine. This light green line is basically testing turn rate at 250 knots down to 200 with the takeoff flaps out, because what I noticed is that compared to the real value and the StatShark value, the value that you get at low speed for sustained turn rate is a lot lower. And I wanted to see if we could kind of recover some of that performance with flaps. And it turns out that we can. I don't know if that's accurate. I don't know if that makes sense, but it kind of does. Now, as far as these overall relationships go, I think we can start from the right of our high-speed turn up here at 450 knots. And the first thing to notice is that the real plane does overperform what StatShark estimates by it's 0.4 degrees per second. This is an extremely minor error. This is something that Gaijin doesn't care about. In game, the value that we get is right around 20. The MiG-29 for its sustained turn rate, it kind of gets up to 20, and it just kind of flatlines through there and kind of sticks through there. Now, at medium speeds, the thing that we notice is that the real flight model, it loses turn rate, and at this point, StatShark and the real one match, but then it goes down. And then once we get to 350, that's where the flight model matches the values that we see in the MiG-29G manual. And for all intents and purposes, until we get down to these values, from this range, this flight model, at least as far as sustained turn rate, is for all intents and purposes pretty darn accurate. Once we get to 250 knots, once we get to low speed, start pulling more AOA, the MiG-29G flight manual says that, hey, we should be able to maintain 16.65 degrees per second. Now, in the future, I might have to go back and look at the way it extrapolated these values and see. It could be it could be wrong. I gotta double check that. I'm always double checking and triple checking, but if I quadruple check, you'll just never get a video is the problem. So, for all intents and purposes, let's say that this is real. And what we see is that, according to StatShark, according to the manual, the plane falls off in game. And according to StatShark and according to the manual, the low end point is actually perfectly accurate, and the high end point is perfectly accurate, and the midpoints have divergence to them. What this kind of means overall, though, is that once you reach a certain AOA, once you reach a certain speed, the bleed rate of the MiG-29 just kind of builds up, and it kind of does indicate what we were suspecting in the video. Now, we can't actually prove this yet because well, the way that I did the CLCD diagram didn't work the first time. So what I've got down here is an honest to God second attempt that goes a little bit better and is a little bit more informative. I have this chart down here because what Prey did is he went and he made me this diagram, which is the CLCD diagram, which is done in the same format as this diagram. So we can take both of these and make an apples to apples comparison. And I overlaid this into a computer program thing to get set points to extrapolate them into this, and that's how I have this chart over here. And we can do kind of a side-by-side comparison that isn't just kind of looking at these and kind of doing it. And here's what we need to look at, is that at high angles of attack, at high coefficient of lift values, the manual shows a higher value than StatShark. The StatShark value that we have that tops out at 0.5 is just below 1.4, whereas the manual is a little bit above. It's about like 1.4, I want to say 6. It might be a little bit less. I have the actual specific value somewhere, but anyways, and you might ask yourself, well, wait, Squish, the nerf said coefficient of lift max was 1.45. Why isn't it on this chart? And here's why. This is what this WTF is. Because I went back and was like, why does this red line not go up to 1.44? And here's why. At 0.5 of drag, it is definitely below 1.4. It is not until 0.7 drag coefficient that we achieve our 1.45 value, which further kind of confirms what we already believe, which is that the buildup of drag at higher angles of attack does cause more drag than what you would expect in real life. That's why this turn rate value at low speed, when you're at high angles of attack, is lower than what you would expect it to be. So just because we have confirmed what we already believe doesn't mean that we shouldn't test different hypotheses. So now let's get to the middle of the spreadsheet, because remember how we got a turn rate value from StatShark that was a little bit bigger than what we found from testing in game? Well, I kind of had the same idea that maybe the bleed rate values that we get from StatShark are also going to be a little bit different than what we observe in WTRTI. So the first thing that I did is I went into the game and I did some bleed rate testing and kind of got a data point of around 350 knots here. And at 350 knots, 25.1 AOA, we experience a minus 329 bleed rate for a turn rate of 23.9. This minus 329 converts to this minus 1079, and what StatShark says that we should be getting for this bleed rate is 27.24 degrees per second. Instead, we are getting 23.9. That means 27.24 subtract 23.9 means that the StatShark is overestimating our turn for the bleed rate value by 3.34 degrees per second. Maybe. That's if this test is perfectly valid and WTRTI doesn't have its own kind of built-in error. Now, just because of this, just because I don't necessarily trust WTRTI, and just because maybe StatShark is off, but maybe it's off the same way across the board in ways that make sense, that means that this is a valid comparison. So I went and I tested it with a couple of different planes. And with the F-16, I think this is the A, the Block 30, Block 40. No, I think it's the C, actually, because you see the things down here. 350 knots, we get a turn rate of 25.9 for negative 197. That corresponds to negative 642. And it means that we take these numbers and StatShark is off by 0.82 degrees. That's pretty accurate, and that's a order of magnitude less than this 3.34. So maybe the F-16, the calculation is pretty accurate, but just because the F-16 is accurate doesn't mean we shouldn't test other things, because maybe it is tied to this AOA value here. So let's go down to the F-18 and see what we get. So the F-18, kind of the same story, minus 303. This corresponds to 994. Our turn rate in the F-18 is 27.1. StatShark says it should be 28.45. The difference between the two is 1.35. So the difference in kind of estimation, the kind of range, is we got a massive error up here of 3.3 degrees, and then a medium error of 1.35, and then like a very low error of 0.82. So that's always something to consider when running these programs. It's also something to consider. That's why I go back and I do at least some form of manual testing. Could it be better? Yes. Will it be better? No, because I don't have 48 hours straight to dedicate to the game to get like the nth little percent, the ups and downs and whatnot. I'm not, in all honesty, it'd be quicker for me to go get a computer science degree and develop my own version of WTRTI to just figure it out for myself and run the test completely automated. Now let's move on to our next little bit. Our next little segue is going to be dealing with the initial turn of the MiG-29. I'm not going to relitigate the sustained turn based on this Russian manual because I'm going to assume that it lines up with the German manual, plus or minus 1 to 1.5 degrees. It's not really something that concerns us. Instead, what I'm going to be showing and testing is the instantaneous turn rate, basically the max pull, and seeing if maybe our max pull turn actually corresponds to the manual to, have more data points. The other thing that's interesting about this manual is being able to derive an angle of attack limitation and then trying to correspond an angle of attack to a coefficient of lift and coefficient of drag to maybe do the math at the end of this. And what we see here is the way that I'm interpreting this is that this little paragraph down here says it's taken at 1,000 meters and it's done with 1,500 kilograms of fuel. On the 913, the Russian MiG-29, that's going to be about 44% of fuel. These lines here correspond to different afterburner settings and different power settings, and the dashed line is for weapons armed, and the solid line is for a perfectly clean airframe. So basically what this is showing is that when you load a bunch of missiles onto the plane, it loses some turn rate, which, I mean, is understandable. The thing to note here is mainly everything to the left of this. What this is showing, the reason that this kind of caps out is this index on the left side, NY, is just Russian for G-forces, which means that the flight envelope for the MiG-29 caps out at 9 Gs, and then it goes down to 7 Gs at high speeds over here. It kind of does like this little step at Mach 0.85. We're not really concerned about this right side. We're really focused on this left side because we're really trying to test for bleed rate and get a more informed perspective. The way that I'm looking at this, though, is this curly QL24 is 24 degrees angle of attack, which means that at roughly 675 kph at 1,000 meters, you should be able to pitch to 24 degrees AOA and reach 9 Gs. That's where it should be. And that 9 Gs will correspond to an initial turn rate. This is not a sustained turn rate. This is an instantaneous turn rate. And what's going to happen is you'll pitch to 24 and you'll ride that 24 AOA all the way down. And you'll just slow down, slow down, slow down. And then you'll reach around 300 kph and you'll be riding 1.9 Gs. And what this allows me to do is get kind of a rough estimation of where the lift to drag should be related to angles of attack. The other thing that this allows me to do is I can look at this and I can look at the footage in the game and get an idea of what the flight control system does. Because one of the issues with War Thunder, one of the hypotheses is that the flight model isn't bad, the instructor's bad. The instructor pulls too much AOA, it doesn't optimize for energy retention, it just kind of, by happenstance, screws you over. And what we see in game is the instructor, the damping mode. I'm not saying instructor and damping mode are the same thing. I use damping, so I'm using that, but an instructor might be similar. It has probably different limitations, but we'll just, for the sake of this conversation, they're the same thing. In game, what happens is we start at 24, and we actually do kind of hit this, and then once we get to lower speed, the plane starts to pull more. Your maximum deflection goes up to around 28, and it goes up to there pretty soon. So it means that looking at this value isn't going to naturally correspond. So I've kind of drawn this line. This line is not here to be like, okay, I'm like, okay, because it's 28, it should be 7 Gs. That's what it should be. It's like, no, this is just to visually show kind of like what's going on, kind of like what the impact of increasing the angle of attack limit should be. And that's rather unfortunate. But what we see in game and what we get based on this diagram is we go down here and we look down here and we're using blue for real, red for Stat Shark, green for WTRTI clean, and purple for WTRTI loaded. And what we see here is that starting at high speeds, Stat Shark does overestimate our initial turn rate pretty much just across the board. And in StatShark, I did confine it to 24 degrees AOA and did try to load up the correct amount of fuel, which the correct amount of fuel should be 44% in the 913. And basically, the real one at high speeds is supposed to do a little bit better than what we observed in game. And then once we get down here, the turn rate that we observe in game for initial turn for our hard pull is higher than the manual. Although this being higher than the manual is pretty easily explained by going from 24 degrees AOA, which should be this line, to actually being 28 degrees AOA. When we test with full missile loadout for R60s and 2 R27s, our initial turn rate goes even further down. So if that solid black line corresponds to fully loaded, it means that it would be even more underperforming at this part, and then eventually matches up, and then it's okay. This by itself doesn't really tell us whether or not the bleed rates are correct, but it does give us something of an indication. Now that we got this out of the way, let's move on over here to our right, because what we're testing here on the right is for bleed rate. And the way that I'm testing for bleed rate, or the way that I think I'm testing for bleed rate, because honestly, this spreadsheet is such a mess that I'm all over the place, is that I am testing the bleed rate in the speed range where the flight control system in damping mode limits you to around 24 degrees AOA. I am not going to test this whole entire line by trying to maintain the perfect AOA all the way down to try to cross-reference these numbers, because it's too difficult, too time-consuming. So we're testing at 650 kph, which is going to be up above this part where it goes to 28, and it means that we can kind of get at least a general idea. Now, previously, we have decided that StatShark does provide us different numbers. We do still include those StatShark numbers as the prediction because they're good reference numbers to have. And a lot of people use StatShark to compare flight models, so it's a good idea to have these numbers. So at 650 for a plane with missiles on it, has 4 R60s and 2 R27Rs. You can see that here on the HUD. I have the R60 selected. You're going to have to take my word for it that I had 27Rs. But we are getting 24.2 AOA, 22 degrees per second, 21.9. We're going to call it 22. We'll round up. And StatShark says we should be getting 24 or 23.8, but we'll just round up. It's off by 0.1. Who cares? So we are missing 2 degrees per second. Also, at this speed, we are losing 350 meters per second worth of energy, of speed, basically. This is our bleed rate value. StatShark does thing in feet per second, convert 350 meters to feet, and look at the numbers between here. 600's down here, 1200's up here. It should be around 800 or 900. Even if you did like a simple conversion factor of times 3, 369, 900 feet per second, 510, 15, 1,050 feet per second worth of bleed rate with missiles on. And this value here is confined to 24. So like where this line intersects, this should be accurate, at least to what StatShark says. So not only are we not getting the turn rate, we are also bleeding more speed, that our bleed rate is actually kind of coinciding with up here. And our turn rate is coinciding with a value that'd be further down here. So we're getting kind of like cut in both ends. And the story is going to be kind of the same for testing the plane without missiles. We're doing 650, 654. Oh no, it's off by 4 kph. Oh no, it's just so bad. 1,035. Oh no, 35 meters. I don't think that matters that much. I don't think it's going to make a gigantic impact. And for 24, we hit minus 350 again. Turn of 23.3. We'll just round it down to 23. And StatShark says we should have 25. So 23, 24, 25. 2 degrees, probably in, we'll call it 1.7, because I think I did a little bit of conversion factor fudging it with rounding, so we'll kind of move it down 1.7 degrees off. And our bleed rate should still be in that between minus 1,200 and minus 600, so minus 900, and we're doing at minus 1150. So we're kind of up here, and we're getting a turn rate value that's down here. Now, I thought that maybe I had fudged this. I had did a boo-boo. Maybe I did this with the air brake on, and I actually tested this again today, and we get this data point down here, and it does mean that there is kind of a margin of error. It's hard to see this because I have 2 screens going on here, because in my capture program, I have display capture on and game capture, so the game is captured a little bit different. But you can still see these numbers. We got 24, 23.2, and minus 332, which 23.2 is still less than this. 340 is a little bit less. It does mean we do have a margin of error, but that does mean that this testing, I think, is valid. This still does assume that WTRTI, the way they collect and calculate specific excess power, is correct, but I mean, that's the best we got so far. Now, just because that's the best we have so far doesn't mean that we can't try to do a little bit better and attack this problem from a different angle, because what we have done here is we have more or less kind of fudged together what the lift to drag values should be for around 24 degrees AOA. We can take the values directly from StatShark and we can go all the way up to the tippy top, and we can plug them into our little calculator program up here. Because earlier on at the beginning of the Excel spreadsheet portion of the video, we determined that all of this math up here was complete crap because of the way that we derived the lift to drag values was wrong, and because we couldn't get an angle of attack to a lift to drag value, we couldn't really use it. Well, because we did all that work, because we have a general idea of what should happen at 24 degrees AOA based on the manuals, we can take some of our testing and we can plug it into here, and that's kind of what we have. Now, the way that this calculator works, just for everyone that's not tracking and hasn't watched the other videos, is we are doing a specific excess power calculation. The way this works is specific excess power is equal to the velocity multiplied by the output of all of this crap in here. And all of this crap in here is the thrust to weight ratio multiplied by the cosine of the angle of attack, which is going to then have the load factor divided by the lift to drag ratio subtracted from it. So this is going to be like a little tiny value that gets multiplied. I cover it in another video. We're not going to worry about it too much. And then the reason that this is a lot more complicated is Excel only does angle in, or does cosine in radians. So we have to go from angle of attack, convert it to radians to get cosine to blah, 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 blah. Anyways, that's math, and nobody cares about doing it. That's why we're just using Excel to do it for us. And we're testing that 650 kph turn against our calculator to have a general idea. So we have a speed of 650 kph. That converts to 592 feet per second. Our thrust is 14,482. Our weight is 12,650. Angle of attack is 24. I didn't go like 24.2, 24 point whatever. It's not going to alter any of this other stuff all that much. This first lift to drag value, this is pulled directly from StatShark. This is physically what the game thinks. This is extrapolated from the files. And if we just use the game value, what happens is we have a predicted specific excess power of minus 945 feet per second, which, by the way, is pretty much in line with what we said earlier, where that value was between 6 and 1200. Between 6 and 12 is around 900 plus or minus, and this value actually does coincide with what StatShark says. These other values are pulling the lift to drag values from this chart down here, but we're indexing them a little bit differently. We're trying to do it kind of both ways to have kind of a range. So this first one is indexing based off of this 1.38 value. We go to 1.38, so 1, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. Okay, we go all the way over here at 1.4. This red line here follows it. We're going to call this intersection 1.8 because it gives us like a nice little rounded kind of number. And we look down here and we go, okay, 4 is here. These are in 0.2 increments or 0.02 because look, 0.3, 0.32, 0.34, 0.36, 0.38, 0.40. So 0.40, 0.42, 0.44, okay, 0.44. We get this, we plug this in, all this other stuff stays the same, and our predicted meters per second bleed rate comes down to minus 271. Maybe we shouldn't have done it that way. Maybe we kind of went that way. So we're going to correspond it to, instead of this, we're going to use this as our starting point. So we're going to start from 0.45. Now, because we know that these are in 0.2s, we go 0.4, 0.42, 0.44. Oh, that's 4.6. Okay, between the two, We come all the way up and we get this lift value of 1.397 is what I'm calling it. Because up here, 1.2, 1.3, or corrections. 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4. I'm calling it just, we're saying that this is like 1.397. It's 1.4. I could use the computer program to get a more in-depth analysis of like kind of like zoom in and kind of like really, really go into it. But even going at it this way, we get a bleed rate value of minus 276. Now, what's neat about this is that it does largely correspond to the values that we see in StatShark. It really largely does correspond to what we see. So that's the good news. Let's move on to some of the bad news, because what we see here is that if we take our inputs from StatShark and use them into this equation, we do get something that kind of matches up with what we kind of felt was going on. If we compare them to the in-game value of minus 340, I did move it down just a little bit from that 350 because we did get a data point at 330. So split the difference, 340. I'm not going to just pick the biggest bleed value to have the biggest amount of difference. We do get a bleed rate prediction difference of minus 52 meters per second. If we use the inputs from the way that we did it with this diagram down here from the manual, we get a little bit of a different prediction, where the difference between the two is 60 to 70 meters per second, where if you use the in-game value, you'll get a closer, and then if you use the manual, you'll get even further. The other issue is that we have to keep in mind that we are not getting the same predicted turn rate versus in-game. Our predicted values are around 25.1. Our in-game values are around 23.3. So we're getting kind of stabbed in both directions, where in the game, if you look at StatShark, the StatShark prediction for a bleed rate of around 23.3, I know this is 23.8, but it corresponds to minus 600, is minus 600 feet per second. Let's round it down. We'll call it minus 600. These are in meters per second, so let's go to their feet per second column. Let's remember minus 600 for the turn rate that we're getting. What we are getting in game is around minus 945 to minus 900. I think I'd have to look at the actual StatShark output to really have an idea of exactly what it's supposed to be, but I think that's fair to assume that these values are at least within the ballpark. Now, just because our turn rate predicted is 25.1, let's all go all the way down. I'm really kind of curious to see this. I haven't checked this yet. But what's our predicted instantaneous turn rate for 650 kph? And 650 kph, I have to do the knots conversion, I think, in my head. I don't really want to have to do that. Oh, cool. We got it down here. 350 is 650, G-force 7.7. Our real turn rate should be 23.6. What we get in StatShark is 25.1. So the real turn rate for what we are getting, or what we're getting in the game, actually does kind of correspond to this number, apparently. So that means that we can actually kind of discount getting stabbed in one direction or getting stabbed in one direction. We're only getting stabbed from the other direction, which means that we can kind of ignore this. We can ignore these predictions, take this as gospel truth, and we're still missing basically 50 to 70 meters per second. We are still bleeding more speed at this high speed than we would like. So does that mean that we have finally solved the MiG-29 flight model? Do we have a rock-solid, concrete conclusion? And my answer so far is no. There is a lot of information that I've gone over here, and there's a lot of information that I still don't have, and there's also a lot of information that I missed, where when I said in the beginning of the video that this is an ongoing conversation, I actually did mean that, because someone's going to respond in the comment and say, hey, did you actually look at it this way? Did you do it this way? Did you consider the fact that maybe this equation is not completely accurate? Have you looked at maybe looking at a different way, where we don't really know? I want to take all of the information that I have, get some new information, and maybe approach it from a different perspective. I will say, kind of coming all the way down here, I think that it is a reasonable conclusion. I would say with maybe a 75% certainty that these lift to drag values that we're seeing in game, with how the lift to drag values end up deviating, especially at these higher drag values compared to this chart, does seem to indicate that our drag for the AOA, especially at low speeds and high AOA, is greater than what we think it should be. It's also kind of shown on here with the way that the drag builds up from 0.5 all the way to 0.7, that maybe this trend, because it continues this way, where at 0.7 this drag value would be down here, and if you continued this line it would be up here, that this error that is maybe present over here at this high AOA is actually pretty egregious, because you have to consider that the plane slams itself to 24 AOA at 650, and then as it goes down, it slams itself all the way up to 28, which would be here. And if 28, or the drag value at 28 is incorrect, or the lift value at 28 is incorrect, it means that the negative bleed rate values are incorrect. But I can't tell you with any degree of certainty how correct that is. The other thing is that I might have to go back and look at this chart and actually end up relitigating the sustained turn rate and look at this entire manual, translate it to English, or go learn Russian and do a whole bunch of other stuff to really find out what is the real truth. And the final bit is that it could still be one of the most accurate flight models in the game. Maybe the MiG-29 flight model is very, very accurate, but based on what we know about the F-16 flight model, with the way that the F-16's turn rates work, where on the F-16 EM diagram on the right side, you are not getting enough sustained turn, and then on the left side, when you get to low speeds, you have too much sustained turn, which translates into not enough energy retention at high speeds, and then too much energy retention at low speeds, where the matchup is kind of skewed in both directions, where the MiG-29 is losing too much speed at high AOA, retaining too much speed at low AOA, and then the F-16 is in the opposite direction, where it does skew the matchup and does skew the perception of the planes. Anyways, that's going to be kind of the end of the video. I'm going to kind of conclude it there. I hope that you guys managed to make it through an hour and 20 minutes of me yapping, and probably another 30 minutes of me looking at an Excel spreadsheet, because I know looking at Excel spreadsheets are not necessarily all that fun or engaging for content, but I'll be reading the comments. I hope smart people respond, and hopefully at a later date, I can come back and tackle this from a new, more informed, even more different perspective.